Alan Macaron and I started studying the foraging ecology of great egrets and snow egrets back in the 1980s. Since that time, some really exciting new technology has arrived on the scene that's allowed us to record GPS positions and accelerometry, and we've taken on these other partners in our research. So today I'd like to talk about the accelerometry data that we're getting from these birds to estimate energy expenditure over the course of the annual cycle. So why study egrets and energy? We've documented birds foraging in all these different habitats. The productivity here is important for the birds as well as other ecosystems. Many of these ecosystems are under threats of development. And what we've done so far is quantify the amount of space that's required in some of these ecosystems. And we believe this has conservation value because then it links the energy that the birds are using and quantitatively actually makes an argument as to how much of these areas need to be protected, or gives a quantitative basis for that protection. So just to review some of the work from areas that we didn't know before. So this was a bird in Wichita, Nelson. It used 17.2 hectares during the breeding season. Another bird, 2691, used 11.4 hectares. So a nice way to quantify the amount of habitat needed for a breeding bird or non-breeding. Here's Clarence. This was a bird during the wintering season in South Carolina, using a lot more hectares. But today I want to focus on energy. So we know that animals have a basal metabolic rate and that they have to catch enough food in order to meet that basal metabolic rate. And then in addition to the BMR, they do all these other things. We collectively call this either the FMR or daily energy expenditure. And there is a rich literature on this that focuses mostly on doubly labeled water. So here are some of the authors, as well as some of the key terms. And in general, that literature looks at an animal's body mass and either predicts or measures its energy use rate based upon that body mass. So it sort of looks at energy expense from 30,000 feet and doesn't look at the individual sorts of activities that birds do. And that's what's important to a behavioral ecologist. I want to know how much energy a bird is going to spend flying or raising chicks or foraging. So we're going to add some granularity to those averages. So we'd like to know how much time and energy is devoted to things that we can measure through accelerometry. And we can identify these three different kinds of things that birds do based upon accelerometry data. We'd also like to know how these quantities vary over the course of a year, over the course of the day, and if there are differences in interaction between annual and daily cycles. So basically, we would like to zoom in from the overall averages down to the granularity that we can observe in the field. So very quickly, our methods. We use a 48-gram bird solar GPS accelerometry unit. It's produced by EOBS. And it gives us a lot of great GPS data that's transmitted through the cell phone network to satellites. But specifically, I'll be talking about its onboard triaxial accelerometer, which measures not only the position of the bird when it's not moving, whether it's horizontal, whether it's vertical, and then in addition, acceleration in all three axes. The way we have programmed this, if you start at the bottom, if you imagine a 4-minute chunk of data or 4-minute time slot, every 4 minutes, the accelerometer is active for 3.8 seconds. Therefore, we get 15 pulses every hour, or 360 evenly spaced recordings of acceleration over the course of a day. We're going to assume that what it's doing for that 3.8 second pulse, we are going to extrapolate to 4 minutes. So that we're basically going to have 360 behaviors labeled for each day. Sometimes this is going to be correct, sometimes it's not, but we think it's going to average out to give the correct representation of what the bird is doing. If you've seen any of our other talks, we begin with live bait and leg hold traps and decoys, and before you know it, we trap a bird and we have it in hand. And then we want to visualize this accelerometry data. This is provided by software called Acceleration Viewer, which was written by Matthias Berger. This is a JavaScript. So this is from a bird named Nelson. This is 3 years worth of accelerometry data compressed into what you might think of as a slinky, as compressed as it can be. And now if you start pulling that slinky out, you start to see patterns. So there are these resting patterns separated by active patterns. A nice aspect of the software is it allows you to put in day-night. And sure enough, the rest patterns are at night. Of course, there is some resting during the day as well. And if you pull the slinky out even further, you can get individual traces. Each period of time between each of these lines going vertically is 3.8 seconds. We want to then be able to quantify how much wiggling there is in these lines. So we can calculate an average for each 3.8 seconds, call it X bar, for how much up and down activity there is. Or for the green line, how much front and back activity there is. And for the red line, how much side-to-side activity there is. And then we can define an index called the overall dynamic body acceleration, or ADBA, that is simply the sum of the variation of each individual x from its mean added to the y from its mean and the z from its mean. And this gives us an overall measure of how variable these lines are, or an aggregate acceleration of a subject. It is a unitless value. We can then graph these ADBAs in a frequency distribution and we get a pattern like this. What I then did was examine what the shape of the traces are when the ADBA is very low, in these medium areas, what they look like during this hump, which happens to be flying, and this very long tail. And this is what the values are for these resting traces. So when the lines are really, really flat with very little variation, we call that rest or still. As it increases, we call these on-ground traces. So you see some rhythmic pattern change between the green line and the blue line in particular. So this is either walking or preening or something. This is clearly stepping. And this is clearly flying, where the amplitude is much higher. Some of the traces get really crazy above, say, 40,000 ADBA. This could be a bird banking, and these were excluded from the analysis. So we can then label the different parts of the frequency distribution with what we think the bird is doing. So this is resting, this is foraging, this is flying, and these are excluded from the analysis. So can we get from the ADBA, which is unitless, to something that has value, and it's already been published in the literature? Resting is fairly straightforward. We're just going to use the equation for basal metabolic rate. All we need to know is the bird's mass. This is established by McNabb. This will also include periods while the bird is foraging but is still. Flying is also fairly distinguishable, and in addition to mass, we need wing length, and that's from Castro and Myers. The tricky part is foraging, and here's how we related ADBA to wattage for foraging. Alan Macaron and I, in a previous study, looked at the stride frequency. From stride frequencies of great egrets, you can interpolate a velocity. And if you know a bird's velocity, you can calculate its wattage. So let's just focus on this lower graph here. We're eventually going to link this graph to the ADBA graph above, which is just the distribution of those on-ground traces from ADBAs of 1126 to 14302. If we look at the frequency distribution of great egret velocities, about the fastest we've clocked a great egret is 0.38 meters per second. Using this relationship here that's published, we then can calculate a wattage for that velocity, and we're going to assume that that's about the most expensive thing the bird is going to do on the ground. So as the velocity varies from very slow to very high, its wattage is also going to correspondingly change. So what we do is line up the ADBA for those values along with the wattage of those values and use a curve fitting device to get this relationship. So essentially we can plug in any value of ADBA for when the bird is on the ground and calculate a wattage. So now we have a wattage for resting, for foraging, and the various levels of foraging, and flying. So when we put that into a little snippet here of the spreadsheet for each 3.8 second snapshot extrapolated to 4 minutes, a bird is always going to have a basal metabolic rate, and if it's not doing anything else, that's the value it gets for that 4 minutes. If it's foraging, it's going to get some variation of an additional rate for foraging, and that gets added to it. Or if it's flying, it can't forage and fly at the same time, it gets that value. So we're going to be analyzing this right-handmost column for this analysis moving forward. So the results I'll present is for a bird named Edward, and we have 492 consecutive days for him. So to answer the question, how much time and energy is devoted to being at rest, on the ground, or flying? Basically 66% resting, this is just the amount of time, 66%, 27% foraging, and basically 7% flying. If we compare this to the amount of energy for each of those, so here are those values. So clearly most of his time, roughly 2/3, is spent resting. Another less than a third foraging, so a fair amount of time foraging. But if we look at the energy in contrast to this, a lot of energy spent at rest. The next ranking energy is flying, because energy is so expensive. And here the interesting thing is that as far as an energy expense, foraging is pretty cheap. And we found the same result in 2004 when we did the stepping frequency study. And this is fortuitous because this tells us that a great egret can spend a lot of time foraging or not that much time foraging, and regardless of that, it's not going to be spending that much energy doing that. So if it needs to adjust how much time it's spending foraging, the additional energy cost there is not great. This is different from a lion, for example, or a cheetah, or even a cormorant that has to swim actively after its prey. So we find this to be sort of an interesting and significant outcome from this study. So then how do these quantities vary with the phase of the annual cycle? Most of this energy is devoted to a basal metabolic rate. We caught Edward in June, So this hump here is the completion of its breeding season. We have a decline in energy use over the post-breeding season. Here's its migration south, wintering, another migration north. Then the early phase here, when it returned to the breeding colony, fairly low energy use, and that increased with this hump here in the breeding season. If we do some statistics, we find statistical differences between these average daily energy usages. So arrival at the colony in small chicks is not significantly different from post-breeding and wintering. Those are actually continuous. As the chicks grow, the amount of energy that the bird spends increases, and it's greatest during migration. We have an independent confirmation of this same phase pattern with an increase over the course of breeding season. If we just look at GPS locations, this is a completely different source of information, and it indicates the same trend. And again, it's based upon distance flown from one GPS location to the other, generally increasing over the course of the breeding season. So we're getting two independent pieces of information saying that the amount of energy spent over the course of the breeding season increases. And we have this precipitous drop-off in post-breeding season, which is also what we see in the accelerometry data. So maybe this is accounted for the fact that the bird's just flying around more when the chicks are getting larger. What if we take the flying data out and just look at the on-ground foraging data? Notice along the y-axis that the values are smaller because foraging is relatively cheap. And we find the same trend. Early in the breeding season, the energy level is low. The only difference here is that medium chicks are only slightly more expensive than small chicks. But we do get this jump in energy expended on the foraging grounds, and that's significantly different. During migration, the birds are either not foraging or foraging very little, since we're only looking at on-ground activities here. The mirror image of this is if we just look at the resting traces. And the resting traces also indicate that the birds experience the least amount of rest when their teenagers are running them around from soccer practice, etc. And also not as much rest during migration, which makes sense. So to summarize, there are significant differences in daily energy use based upon the phase of the annual cycle. When the chicks are small, or the bird has arrived at the colony, compared to post-breeding and wintering, those are all significantly the same, lowest amount of energy use. Increase in energy use as the chicks grow, the largest during migration. How do the quantities vary with time of day? Well, here's a representation of that data. Clearly, we see this peak in energy expenditure at about 8 in the morning, very little in the wee hours of the morning and at night, and we get this secondary burst of activity at the end of the day when the bird is returning to the colony. And is there an interaction between phase of the annual cycle and day? This is also highly significant, and the point here being that in some cases maybe the distribution is sort of unimodal to being somewhat bimodal, so that essentially the significant interaction says that these values are changing differently over the course of the time of day depending upon the phase. What you should notice here is there's a fair amount of variation between these bars. And this is sort of a fingerprint of the breeding season. On breeding season, post-breeding and wintering, notice how much smoother these relationships are. In wintering here, this looks just, this one peak, the birds leave the colony, and then we have a nice sort of flat level here and a return. It's much less variation. Migration, we see the least amount of energy spent during the day and the most at night, and we know the birds migrate at that point. So we feel fairly comfortable in quantifying the amount of energy that a bird is spending based upon accelerometry. This allows us to make predictions. If we know how much energy a bird is spending, well, it's got to gain that much energy from the foraging grounds. And this is a prediction of how many fish of various sizes a bird would have to eat over the course of a day based upon its energy use. So this would be during the wintering phase, 12 8-centimeter long red shiners. So this is something we can then test in the field. So it's always nice in science when we can make predictions about what we're going to see based upon what we know in more of a deductive, predictive sort of fashion. And that's all I've got. So let me know if you have any questions.